There has been a lot of political drama in South Africa that has a bearing on the performance of the economy. Contradictions within the cabinet itself, conflicted statements from officials of the ANC, as well as the parliamentary debate that we saw this past week. So, what is the impact of all of this? Minister of Mineral Resources going out and issuing a statement on the banks and calling for a judicial commission of inquiry. Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, responding and saying that there is no need for such because South Africa has got institutions and instruments that are quite capable of dealing with any complaints regarding the banks. And of course, the opposition parties themselves calling for discussion, debate on state capture. What exactly is going on in South Africa and what is the meaning of all of this? The Chief Economist with Investment Solutions is Mr. Lesiba Mothata, who is with us on the program tonight to help make sense of what appears to be confusing and causing trouble out there in the markets. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Pratem. Thank you
for
being here.
You know, for some of us, we read the news, we watch, and you know, you can look at it and say, it's just drama. Yeah. It's fascinating. From a news point of view, it makes the news, and that's about it. But there are underlying things that happen when these issues arise, isn't it?
Most definitely, and you would see that in weeks where there's heightened confusion, rhetoric around politics and what's happening, you find markets that are causing the rand to sell off, even in outcomes when emerging markets are liked, as we have seen in the last week. There's demand for emerging market assets, which will include South Africa. But even in those environments, we have found that the rand would have been selling off. Even in the bonds, we look at bonds yields, we find that if they go up, it's always a sign that there's risk that's been felt, there's anxiousness that's been seen by investors, and we see an outcome where yields go up. And also bank shares. They tell a story. When you get bank shares that just decline without any material outcome that is domestic in nature, around earnings, something fundamental, but when investors fear what could happen in the political space, those are the three things to look at. Bond yields, bank shares, along with what happens in the currency. And when we have had maximum angst, we have seen markets sell off in that way.
But you know, one can say what we have seen are mere incidents that have got short-term impact. If you take a longer-term view, you would say South Africa is politically stable, so there's no need to worry. These are things that should be of concern maybe to people who participate in the financial services market, but otherwise they will smooth or even out in due time, so there's no need to be concerned.
Indeed, the long-term matters. Indeed, things normally normalize going forward, but there is an impact in the short term if you get protracted instability, uncertainty, particularly around matters of finance. A weak rand is not good for everyone, not only about those who are investors, those who are invested on the JSE, or they're interested in the economy from that basis, but even the poor get impacted by the outcome of a depreciating currency. We see that outcome now, where inflation is high, and it requires the central bank to hike interest rates as a result of this high inflation due to, amongst other factors, which includes the drought, a weaker currency. So everyone gets impacted by the cost of living when inflation goes up the way we have seen. Also because like food prices have been going up, the cost of debt goes up, it goes to the pockets of every single citizen in this country, including everyone who's struggling to make ends meet. We have seen in the first quarter more than 150,000 people losing jobs. And when you have a situation like this in the economy, like we have in our country now, I really do think that the responses need to be different. So this is not helpful.
It's not just drama then. You can't sit at home and switch on the television and say, I'm loving this. I'm enjoying when I see all the mess that's going out there, because ultimately it has the impact that you mentioned. Now, let's go back a few weeks, right? Earlier, the issue was around Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, being investigated by the Hawks, and there was a lot of concern that these these investigations must be stopped, right? The deputy president went as far as it's unseemly for the state to be seen to be at war with itself. Right. But that did not necessarily slow down or stop at all. It's just that the minister left the country, was out of the country for a while. And then when he's out of the country, his colleague in cabinet, minister responsible for mineral resources, issues a statement about an area of Minister of Finance's competency, the banks, and says a judicial commission of inquiry is going to be held to investigate the banks on behalf of the Gupta family, for that matter. And then statement repudiated by the presidency. When you saw all of those things happen, they happened within 24 hours, actually, from the first statement to the repudiation thereof. What went through your mind? What did you think?
You see, South Africa has institutions that are strong, an institution that look at all matters. If you look at the central bank, if you look at the judiciary, you look even the banking regulator. In fact, around banks, South Africa ranks the highest from the World Economic Forum rankings. Our banks are well capitalized. Their lending practices are their prerogative because they've got their own risk models. They look at matters around quality of risk, the credit quality of the individual who's borrowing, or the corporate, which I think it's a private affair between the two. So when we get a situation where there's just confusing and conflicting messages from what needs to be the same home, the same house, it's not ideal, because what we're beginning to see is that there are different ideological contrasts that are happening in the parliament, which I don't think are helping South Africa. We need a concerted view that comes out with one voice. We need to make sure that we actually focus on that which matters. When the ministers in G20, the discussion at G20 was about how we get the economies moving forward after the financial crisis, because what we've seen now is that economic activity is below trend globally. So the discussion, while this is happening domestically around these matters, everyone else in the globe, as evidence in the G20, is talking about looking at innovation, making sure that globalization continues, as we have seen elsewhere, because there's now talk that globalization is not ideal. People are more looking inward. There's policies constructed by governments that are more inward focused. So all I'm saying is we need to keep our minds on what matters. We need a house that's united. We need one voice that comes from all sectors of the parliament or government. We also need an outcome where we focus on creating jobs and uniting this economy. There's far too much angst. It leaves me as a South African feeling unhappy about what's happening.
You know, I can live with the difference personally in terms of parliament, right? Because political parties have got their own ideologies, different agendas and so on. And we'll talk about what transpired there. But it is when it's cabinet itself that seems muddled and confused when it issues a statement. Because obviously this collegial approach to things, that is a cabinet collective, and the protocols that govern how it communicates, they were breached, to my mind, when that statement was issued. What did you think?
It just really is unideal to have had number one citizen in the country having to come out and saying from the presidency, we don't associate with that view. It's not what we have put out. It is on his personal account. That is unideal. It really just shows the house that's divided, and we need to work better.
But here's another one. Again, in the same mix, the minister responsible for cooperative governance, who was appointed Minister of Finance for a couple of days, he himself called a press conference and saying, Minister of Finance must hand himself over to the police or to the hawks.
You know, there will always be opinions, and we're in a democracy. I think everyone has a right to talk. It's just problematic when it comes at the highest level, as we see at this point in time, creating confusion in society, and also create unsettling confidence around businesses, even around consumers. Where we are now, we need to be focusing on not becoming a Brazil. You look at that economy, it's in a recession now in its second year. They've impeached their president, and the outlook going forward remains dire. They are dependent on commodities. They are also part of BRICS, by the way, and their fiscus is under strain. Debt levels have increased, and there isn't enough growth to make sure that debt levels are serviced better. I think we need to really just look beyond all these and say, do not become a Brazil. These conversations are leading us to that.
Well, in Parliament then you had a debate on state capture, which in part was triggered by the very statement issued by Minister of Mineral Resources, Msebenzi Zwane, and his subsequent utterances and interviews, where, for all intents and purposes, he actually defended his position anyway in Parliament.
I've seen that, and it's just undesired that we have a very opposing views.
Let me put my question differently to you then. If that is the case, right, and you're not the only one, there are other observers, commentators who are saying the same thing, what is it that you think makes those responsible for leading and managing the country and protecting the economic interest to miss the point then? What do you think?
There's clearly a few forces that are at play here. In government, there seem to be contradictions that are coming, and external forces. They're confirmed by what you'll hear even from the Minister of Finance, that there are interest groups that are having a louder voice than would have had in our economy, which is all very undesired. I think we need a leadership that arrives and says, focus on that which matters. Look at what is at stake here, because what is at stake is an erosion of institutions. What is at stake is the erosion of the national treasury, which is of a world class in terms of its contribution. Fiscal policy, by all investors, has been seen to be worthwhile trusting coming out of South Africa. You don't want that to be derailed or weakened by any measure. So what needs to happen here is one voice, one view, a united house.
And of course, the matter that concerned South Africa for some time was that of potential downgrade by the ratings agencies some time back. And South Africa is not out of the woods yet, because there's another round coming within a month or two, a couple of months in December. But, you know, one could say we generally, as a people, as a nation, are behaving like we are sorted when we are not.
We indeed are not. Rating agencies are looking at this in a big way. I do think that when the medium-term budget policy statement is going to be tabulated in October, we'll be looked with intensity to see if there's any fiscal slippage. Also, if that debt level is going to be moderated around 53% of GDP. You know, with all that said, South Africa is well on its way of avoiding a negative outcome if it continues on a path that is sound. There are no external factors that will result us with being downgraded easily, because China, which we are closely linked to, is doing better in economic growth. You look elsewhere in the world, including the US, there is a growth outcome that's happening, helping South Africa, evidenced with the third quarter GDP. But if we continue to inflict pain on ourselves, and these machinations that are happening around the leadership of the National Treasury and confusion about banking and whether there's going to be inquiries set up or not, are just a self-inflicted problem, which when rating agencies have to sit down and make a decision, it becomes an easy decision to be made.
Let me hear your opinion on the state-owned entities, because there's concern raised about a whole number of them. What's your view, having looked at them?
It's clear that almost $500 billion is being used to guarantee state-owned enterprises. The lion's share of that, more than 75%, is towards Eskom, which is understandable. We need electricity to have a running economy. It is, however, problematic if we're just increasing the amount of bailouts that are given to these state-owned enterprises on the one hand. It's equally not desired when domestic capital, and South Africa is a wash of capital. You look at what corporates are sitting on in terms of cash. You look at what savings are in SA, including companies like those in fixed income. When they begin to raise their voices and say that they're not going to lend to state-owned enterprises, I think it's very unfortunate. It's unfortunate when an economy is awash with capital, and also when we just have such a dependency on the fiscus, because that needs to be removed. We need to see fewer guarantees.
Final question, brief response from you. What is the future of BRICS? Brazil is in trouble, and we have our own domestic issues. We're not in trouble yet to that extent. Do you think that BRICS is sustainable in the medium to long term on the basis of what's happened in Brazil?
I think BRICS is an interesting political concept. It is still a political concept. The BRICS Development Bank, it has been instituted. One needs to find out if there's been any lending that has happened from that end. I think there's merits in that grouping of economies. I think they are sustainable. They're all having challenges, but India is heads and shoulders above the rest, growing at more than 6%. I think is doing very well from that end. Brazil is in problems, as we chatted earlier, but also Russia seemingly is actually turning around in terms of the economic fortunes. I think it's a grouping that is needed. We do need alternative sources of finance away from the traditional ones, and I think there's merit in that structure.
Lesiba Mothata, much appreciated. Thank you very much for having had a chat with us here on our program.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting.
We appreciate it.
Cool.
Well, there's always a link between politics and the economy, as the Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, reminded us this past week. So whenever you watch Parliament, I know it's a very popular show now these days, pay attention, because the developments there have a bearing on what happens to your pocket and household, particularly the statements as well that come from cabinet. But this is South Africa. We're all here, and we will jointly try and search and find solutions that will take us forward and help the economy grow.